Mrs. Pendrid stopped so abruptly that the woman behind her, Mrs. Lapping, very nearly embedded her nose into the back of the former's hat. This hat, a stiff mauve structure festooned with artificial berries, wobbled indignantly as Mrs. Pendrid lifted one gloved hand and pointed it, rather accusingly, at the centerpiece of Horace Mellin's stall. Her eyes, Mrs. Pendrid whispered, as though the bride in question might be listening, were not that shade of blue when I passed earlier. Mrs. Lapping, who prided herself on both sensibleness and a talent for seeing through other women's theatrics, narrowed her own eyes at the figure. "It's possible," she said, "that you simply failed to register their exact shade at the time?" Mrs. Pendrid looked offended by the idea that she might misremember something so vital as ocular hue. "I know what I saw," she insisted, "and they were not blue, they were grey, positively slate grey." The bridal doll stood encased in a glass cabinet taller than a man, her waxen hands arranged demurely around a bouquet of artificial roses. She wore a gown of improbable whiteness, the sort that seemed designed less for wear and more for moral signalling. A lace veil shrouded her face, though not enough to conceal the curiously elongated proportions of her cheeks, the narrow chin, the lips pressed with an almost human softness into contemplative calm. What most unsettled Mrs. Pendrid, however, were the eyes, two vivid blue glass orbs that did seem, in the tremulous autumn light, to catch reflections with an almost lifelike glimmer. And as she stared at them, Mrs. Pendrid felt, quite unreasonably, that the doll stared back. Inspector Purbright, who had wandered onto the craft fair grounds in hopes of locating a jar of plum chutney Mrs. Purbright favoured, noticed the small commotion forming by Mellin's stall. It was difficult not to, as Mrs. Pendrid's dismay possessed an unmistakable carrying quality, like a church bell tuned to scandal. Horace Mellin himself was nowhere immediately visible, though Purbright spotted the tip of his elbow protruding from behind the muslin covering at the rear of the stall. It appeared to be shaking in an oddly rhythmic manner, as though Mellin were adjusting something out of sight. A faint clatter followed, and then a muffled sound that might have been a groan, or might have been the creak of some wooden apparatus forced to bear unexpected weight. Unexpected weight. Purbright approached at his usual unhurried pace. The bridal doll's presence struck him instantly as peculiar, though he forced himself to inspect it with the same calm curiosity he reserved for the town's more eccentric volunteer gardeners. The proportions were unsettlingly accurate. The slope of the shoulders, the subtle inward curve of the spine, the fingertips that showed no carving marks at all. Even the veil was stitched with a precision suggesting long hours of careful work. He leaned a fraction closer and caught the aroma of something faintly floral. Lavender, perhaps, though not the sort sold in the sachets nearby. His scent was softer, warmer, carrying with it a whisper of familiarity he could not immediately place. Mrs. Pendrid seized the opportunity to express outrage directly to him. "Inspector, I should hope you recognize something off about that object." She gestured at the glass case as one might toward an unsavory relative who had appeared uninvited at dinner. "It is unnatural." Purbright offered a mild smile. "Unnatural is a rather sweeping category, Mrs. Pendrid. Might you be more specific?" "The eyes," she declared triumphantly. A changed colour. Without permission, Purbright dipped his head, examining them again. "They appear blue," he observed. "They were grey," Mrs. Pendrid insisted. Mrs. Lapping sniffed. "She's had one of her spells, Inspector." "Why do not have spells?" Mrs. Pendrid snapped. Purbright let the two settle into their accustomed rivalry before he turned attention to the back of the stall. "Mister?" "Mellin?" A rustling sound answered him, and then Horace Mellin emerged. He was a narrow, bony man of indeterminate age, somewhere between 50 and the twilight of exhausting middle age, whose expression carried the perpetual startlement of someone not quite done, apologizing for his own existence. "Ah," Inspector Mellin wheezed. "I didn't see you there. Forgive me. Busy morning. Very busy." He dabbed at his brow with a handkerchief that bore smudges of something pale and dusty, perhaps plaster or talc. "I gather your exhibit has attracted interest," Purbright said. Mellin's eyes darted anxiously toward the doll. "Yes, she's something of a new direction for me." "A full-size bride?" Purbright asked politely. Mellin swallowed. His Adam's apple bobbed with surprising vigor. "Just an experiment. A commission. Private, you understand." Mrs. Pendrid gave a scandalized gasp. "A private? For whom?" "A Mrs. Pendrid," Purbright murmured. I am certain the Inspectorate of Police is not authorized to disclose client details pertaining to commissioned art. But it's indecent. Purbright asked mildly. This question effectively stunned Mrs. Pendrid into silence. Mellin, perhaps relieved, sagged back against the stool. She's very delicate, he said. The construction was difficult, complicated. My sister helped with the clothwork, only the cloth mined. The figure is entirely mine. Purbright recalled with a gentle inward sigh that entirely mine was a phrase often uttered by those whose stories would inevitably prove less than forthright. Before he could question further, Mellin's knees abruptly buckled. He reached for the tablecloth, missed it entirely, and crumpled to the ground. Mrs. Lapping shrieked. Mrs. Pendrid clutched her handbag to her chest as though warding off a swoon of her own. Purbright knelt swiftly beside Mellin. The man's breathing was rapid and shallow. His lips parted faintly, and a whisper escaped, so soft the inspector almost doubted he'd heard it. Change her back. Purbright leaned closer. A back? From what, Mr. Mellin? But Mellin had slipped into unconsciousness, leaving only that strange phrase behind, floating in the autumn air like a discarded thread waiting for someone, eventually, to pick it up. Purbright's gaze drifted once more toward the bridal doll. The blue glass eyes seemed fixed on Mellin's prone form with an expression that, had it belonged to a living woman, might have been interpreted as concern, or pity, or something else entirely. The scent of lavender lingered faintly, uncertain and inexplicably familiar, as the inspector rose and signalled for assistance. By the time the ambulance carried Horace Mellin away and the craft fair resumed its uneasy shuffle, Flaxborough had already begun its favourite sport, embroidery of the Halfner. Nothing delighted the town quite like a mystery that required no personal risk yet permitted ample speculation over crockery. At precisely 4 o'clock, when kettles across the district performed their communal whistle, the day's gossip settled into its natural habitats. Linen-draped parlours, doily-weighted tables, and the softly closing doors of terrooms whose proprietors pretended not to listen. Mrs. Pendrid, still flushed with righteous alarm, had installed herself in Mrs. Pucklington's establishment and was recounting her eyewitness experience for the third time to an audience of 2. Mrs. Lapping, who sat with arms firmly crossed, and a young woman named Teresa Bolland, who worked in the library and had the unwise habit of believing everything adults with hats told her. I assure you, Mrs. Pendrid began again. The eyes changed. You may call me fanciful, but I know what I saw. A transformation before my very eyes. Mrs. Lapping made a noise resembling the cough of an unimpressed sparrow. The only transformation, she murmured, was your imagination shifting gears. Teresa leaned forward. Oh, but if the eyes did change, might it not mean the doll is mechanical? Perhaps it's the kind that moves when someone pulls a lever. Mrs. Pendrid pressed her lips together. My dear, that doll was not made for children. It had the proportions of, she faltered delicately, a grown woman. Well, Teresa said, perhaps Mr. Mellin was trying something artistic. Artistic, Mrs. Pendrid exclaimed. A bride in a glass coffin, and those 2 human hands. There is something unwholesome about it. This, spoken loudly enough for the terroom to hear, caused several heads to turn. Among them was that of Mrs. Venner, a woman so lean and alert she gave the impression of listening even when asleep. She rose, collected her tray, and drifted toward the trio with the purposeful smoothness of a cat that has just discovered unattended fish. If it's Mellin's bride you're discussing, she said, sliding into the adjacent chair without permission, I can tell you something that will give you a start. Mrs. Pendrid inhaled sharply, already primed for outrage. Teresa blinked. Mrs. Lapping muttered, "A heaven preserve us," in a tone that suggested resignation rather than hope. Mrs. Venner placed her cup down with theatrical delicacy. I heard crying. There was a brief, potent silence. In the workshop, she continued, 2 nights ago, soft crying, like a woman's. I was passing the lane behind the Mellin house, and I distinctly heard it. Mrs. Pendrid gasped with a satisfaction that suggested the universe had finally begun taking her seriously. Teresa's eyes widened. Mrs. Lapping rubbed the bridge of her nose. It could have been Winifred Mellin, Teresa offered. She's a bit nervous-looking. Mrs. Venner shook her head firmly. No, the crying was young and frightened. And what? Mrs. Lapping asked with pointed patience. What were you doing in that lane at night? Mrs. Venner stiffened. I was delivering a medicinal broth to my cousin. His digestion, Yes, yes, Mrs. Lapping cut in. How fortunate you happened to pass at the private moment someone was swallowing their despair. Mrs. Venner ignored this. I know what I heard, and it makes sense, doesn't it? A life-size doll, a secretive workshop, and Mr. Mellon carrying on like someone burdened with shame. Teresa shivered. Do you suppose the doll is based on someone real? Mrs. Pendrid seized the idea instantly. Modelled after a missing girl, you mean? Oh, what a dreadful but likely thought. It wouldn't be the first time craftsmen used unfortunate methods, Mrs. Venner added darkly. Remember the taxidermist scandal in Ely? There was no scandal in Ely, Mrs. Lapping snapped. Your sister invented it because she misread a newspaper headline. Mrs. Venner ignored her again. We heard a rumour. You heard something else? Mrs. Lapping sounded exhausted. That Mrs. Latchworth is furious because she believes the doll resembles her niece, the one who worked at the King's Arms for a spell. A barmaid. Mrs. Pendred breathed. Heavens! Heavens! You don't suppose, but what she supposed was drowned out by the clatter of the terroon door as Mr. Simper, the craft fair treasurer, entered with the gait of a man expecting trouble to follow close behind. His face, normally arranged in meek neutrality, bore the unmistakable blush of someone who had spent the last hour answering questions beyond his emotional pay grade. Mrs. Pendrid pounced. Mr. Simper, you were at the fair. You saw the doll. Is it true that Mr. Mellon brought a woman with him to set up the stall? Simper froze mid-step. Laywoman. That's what she says, said Mrs. Lapping, jerking her thumb at the storyteller of the hour. Mrs. Venner looked offended. I never said that. But I did hear. Simper swallowed. Oh well, there was someone, only briefly, early this morning before the gates opened. I thought it was Winifred Mellon. You thought, Mrs. Pendred pounced again. It was dark in the tent, he muttered, and she wore a shawl. Could have been her, could have been someone else. Someone else, Teresa echoed, fingers pressed to her lips. Simper gave the room an anguished glance, as though searching for an exit that gossip had not blocked. I didn't pay attention at the time. I was rearranging the pottery tables. Someone nearly put the bowls next to the jams again. Mrs. Pendred waved this irrelevance aside. So the doll may have been assisted into existence by another woman, possibly young, possibly crying. Simper blinked rapidly. Crying? Mrs. Venner nodded with solemn self-importance. Simper opened his mouth, closed it, then attempted reassurance with the skill of a man accustomed to being contradicted. A doll is just wax and cloth, nothing more. Mrs. Pendred leaned back, triumphant. Wax and cloth do not change eye colour, Mr. Simper, he wilted. Perhaps the lighting shifted. The lighting does not shift that much, Mrs. Pendred informed him. Simper gave up entirely and moved toward the counter, where he ordered tea with the subdued air of someone hoping a strong infusion might dissolve the memory of the last 10 minutes. Outside the terroon window, the sky had clouded over in that particularly English way, quietly, politely, yet with unmistakable determination. Pedestrians passed, carrying shopping bags, umbrellas, and the day's newest rumours as if all were of equivalent practical value. Unseen by Mrs. Pendrid or her companions, Inspector Purbright passed by the window at a measured pace, hands in his coat pockets, expression thoughtful. He did not enter the terroon, nor show any sign that he heard what was being said inside. But he had already received his own sampling of the day's gossip from the fairgrounds and was now letting it steep, gently, cautiously, like tea left to draw to just the right strength. The doll, the eyes, the faint lavender scent, and Horace Mellon's whispered plea formed the early threads of a tapestry whose pattern had yet to emerge. Now, as whispers thickened behind glass and porcelain, Purbright allowed himself a slow breath. Flaxborough was speaking. And as always, every voice revealed something, if one listened closely enough. Inspector Purbright had long observed that Flaxborough's gossip travelled in patterns not unlike migrating birds. It moved swiftly, purposefully, and with an air of collective certainty, even when heading entirely in the wrong direction. By the next morning, it had settled roost-like across the town. Everywhere Purbright walked, he sensed the ripple of murmured speculation trailing behind him like a politely disguised tailcoat. He began his inquiries with the Mellon household, a modest, neat structure where the curtains were drawn so tightly they resembled the eyelids of someone determined not to see mischief occurring outside. Winifred Mellon opened the door with the stiff posture of a woman who believed every visitor might be secretly evaluating her housekeeping. Inspector Purbright, she said, as if it were an accusation one could polish to a shine. If you've come about Horace, he is resting for... Dr. Billsworth says it was shock brought on by overwork. I hope he recovers quickly, Purbright replied in his most amicable tone. Might I trouble you for a few minutes? Only to clarify certain small matters. Her lips pressed together with the firmness of a woman accustomed to correcting the posture of table linens. I suppose so. If it must be done... She ushered him into a sitting room whose furniture showed evidence of careful, lifelong tending, polished armrests, cushions plumped into respectful obedience, and a lace antimacassar positioned to guard the chair from any unseemly hair oil. Winifred sat on the edge of her seat, her expression composed but taut. Purbright began gently. Your brother's exhibit at the craft fair was quite remarkable. Winifred's eyes hardened. Remarkable. It was a disgraceful ordeal, thrusting him under the scrutiny of people who enjoy nothing so much as whispering behind their teacups. Purbright noted the reflexive defensiveness. He seemed quite dedicated to the work. Did you assist him? Her chin lifted a fraction. Certainly not. I have always left Horace to his hobbies. Hobbies? Purbright repeated mildly. Toy-making, she sniffed, a pastime more suitable for someone with sturdier nerves, if you ask me, but he insists upon it. Purbright allowed this to settle, tilting his head as he inspected the room. On a nearby side table, he noticed a small, half-finished embroidery depicting a bouquet of lilies, the stitches neat but tense, pulled too tight, as though the needle had been driven through cloth with a little more force than necessary. Your brother mentioned, Purbright said quietly, that the bride figure was a commission. Winifred's hand flew to the embroidery frame as though to shield it. He said that. Well, he must have been confused. Horace is in no condition to speak of commissions. There was no commission. We see, Purbright murmured. Then the piece was his own creation? She hesitated. It was the smallest pause, barely the length of a blink, but Purbright caught it. He worked alone, she said finally, entirely alone. The words were spoken too quickly, like a door slammed before one sees who is approaching. Purbright filed this away without altering his expression. I appreciate your time, Miss Mellin, he said, rising. Perhaps I might speak with him once he's feeling stronger. She nodded stiffly, and he took his leave, feeling her gaze linger upon him with the wary intensity of someone guarding not a home, but a secret. From the Mellin residence, Purbright made his way toward the town hall, where he found Mr. Simper the treasurer hunched over a stack of paperwork with the air of a man attempting to hide behind documents. There you are, Inspector, Simper said, looking up with a start. I feared you might want to ask questions. Ah, I do, Purbright replied pleasantly, but please don't let that alarm you. I assure you my questions are entirely pedestrian. Simper's lips trembled in a weak attempt at a smile. The fair went dreadfully wrong. I knew that Doll would stir trouble. I told Mellin to use the smaller exhibit space, but he insisted on the central tent. A decision that attracted quite a crowd, Purbright remarked. Simper sighed. Crowds always attract opinions, and opinions attract headaches. Purbright folded his hands calmly. Yesterday you mentioned seeing someone helping Mellin set up. Would you mind describing them? Simper withdrew immediately into fluster. It was early. Before sunrise, I was moving crates of crockery. I hardly saw anything. But you did see someone? Simper swallowed. Yes, I suppose so. A figure in a shawl. I assumed it was his sister. Did you speak to her? No. It was only a moment. She seemed to be adjusting the doll's veil or perhaps straightening the glass case. I couldn't tell. Purbright nodded. And you're certain it was a woman? Simper hesitated. Well, yes, I think so. Quelque The posture looked feminine. And the hands small, maybe? I don't know. Honestly, Inspector, I feel rather foolish now. You needn't, Purbright said. You've provided more than you think. Simper blinked nervously. Have I? Oh, yes. Purbright smiled. Our descriptions rarely arrive fully formed. We must assemble them with patience. Simper looked as though patience were a trait that had eluded him since birth. And Purbright added lightly, You can confirm that Mellin's bride was entirely blue-eyed from the moment you saw it? Simper stared. You blue? No, Inspector. They were a sort of murky greenish-grey when I checked the glass. Purbright felt a faint flicker of interest. You are certain, as a man can be before breakfast, Simper said with unexpected firmness. I see. Thank you. He left Simper chewing his lip in confusion and took the short walk to Dr. Billsworth's surgery, where the physician was finishing his morning rounds. Billsworth was a round-headed man with the unshakable good cheer of someone who enjoyed both medicine and other people's ailments. "Horace Mellon," Billsworth said, rolling his eyes heavenward, stressed, dehydrated, and possibly overwrought from too much solitude. "The man talks to his toys. Harmlessly, of course. Did he say anything unusual?" Purbright asked. "He rambled," Billsworth said, lowering his voice. "There's something about a promise he couldn't keep, something he'd been forced to revisit." Purbright repeated. "Or an obligation. Hard to say." He drifted in and out. Mentioned lace, oddly enough. Kept fiddling with his own cuff as though it were, well, not a cuff. The doctor shrugged. "A shock makes people say peculiar things." Purbright stepped out into the mild afternoon with a sense of threads gently beginning to draw toward one another. Winifred's defensive insistence that she had not assisted. Simper's half-glimpsed woman. Mellon's muttered references to promises and lasers. The changing eyes. None of it formed a picture yet, but Purbright knew better than to rush. Human puzzles required time for the varnish to crack, the layers to open. And Flaxborough, however self-assured in its gossip, always yielded its truths reluctantly, like a stubborn drawer resisting its own contents. As he walked down the quiet lane toward the station, a faint scent of lavender drifted again, carried on the afternoon breeze from some unseen source. It brushed his senses lightly, triggering that same tug of recognition that had unsettled him at the fair. Somewhere in this small, orderly town, something had shifted, and it was moving, however quietly, toward being seen. The next morning brought with it a crispness that suggested a change of season, or, in Flaxborough's case, a change of opinion. The town's murmurs had reorganized themselves neatly overnight, landing upon a single satisfying conclusion. Someone must be blamed, and preferably someone who would not argue too cleverly. By the time Purbright reached the station, Sergeant Love was already waiting with a hopeful expression, holding a thin file as though it were a long-sought solution to all administrative headaches. "We've got him, sir," Love said, puffing out his chest slightly. Purbright set down his coat. "Got whom, Sergeant?" "Waffle. Dennis Waffle. Caused a disturbance at the craft fair last year. Unscrewed the heads off the papier-mâché geese and arranged them in the jam display. You may recall the uproar." Purbright did recall it. The geese had worn expressions that ranged from startled to philosophical, and the jam stall had never fully recovered its reputation. "You believe he interfered with Mellon's display?" Purbright asked calmly. Love nodded eagerly. Who else would? "A life-size doll with shifting eyes. Sounds like exactly the sort of mischief he finds amusing. And he was seen near the fairground yesterday morning." Seen by a Mrs. Kundal. Purbright hesitated. "The same Mrs. Kundal who once reported a ghost stealing cucumbers from her greenhouse?" Love deflated slightly but stood his ground. "Yes, sir. But she insists Waffle was skulking near the central tent." "Skulking?" Purbright repeated. "Her word." "Yes, sir." Purbright gestured for the file. Love handed it to him with the pride of a man presenting a trophy. Inside was a single sheet containing Waffle's past misdemeanors, none of which involved craftsmanship, dolls, glass cases, or, most notably, bridal themes. Still, Purbright withheld any visible skepticism. It was the duty of a police inspector to remain a calm island amidst the tides of local certainty. "Well," he said, "let us speak with Mr. Waffle." Dennis Waffle lived in a cramped flat above a bicycle repair shop where the scent of rubber permeated everything, even his personality. He opened the door in a shirt that had been washed so often it no longer claimed allegiance to any particular colour. "Inspector Purbright," Waffle said cheerfully. "And Sergeant Love, what a treat. Come to see my new collection of novelty whistles." Perhaps another time," Purbright replied kindly. "We're looking into Mr. Mellon's unfortunate collapse at the fair." "Oh, that," Waffle said, as though the matter were a passing inconvenience, like a delayed post or a sudden rain shower. "Terribly dramatic. I saw them carrying him off. Looked like a wilted carrot." "You were at the fair early?" Purbright asked. Waffle nodded. "Wanted to see if the pottery ladies had improved their glazes. They haven't." Love leaned forward. "Were you near Mellon's stall?" "We're near it." "Yes, around it." "Also, yes, inside it." "No, didn't dare. That bright of his gave me the shivers. Looked too real." "And did you touch the display?" Love pressed. Waffle blinked. Touch it? Good heavens, no. I'm mischievous, not deranged. Why would I meddle with something that looks like it might get up and walk off? Purbright regarded him with mild interest. So you noticed its realism? Noticed, Waffle said. I nearly apologized to it for staring. This candour might have seemed rehearsed in someone else, but in Waffle it was simply the natural outpouring of a man whose thoughts flowed unfiltered from mind to mouth. Do you recall the colour of its eyes? Purbright asked. A greenish grey, Waffle said promptly. He's sort of like a pond on a cloudy day. Did they change? Love shifted uncomfortably. Purbright simply nodded. Or so it seems. Waffle whistled, an instinctive behaviour, given his hobby. Then you can rule me out, Inspector. If I'd found a way to make a doll's eyes switch colours, I'd be using it to win bets at the pub, not wasting it on bridal displays. It was a peculiar logic, but strangely sound. Purbright stood. Thank you, Mr. Waffle. You've been helpful. You've been helpful. Any time, Waffle said. Do come back for the whistles. I've got one that sounds like a sheep with stage fright. And as Purbright and Love exited the building, Love ventured cautiously. Sir, you don't believe he did it? Purbright smiled faintly. Mr. Waffle is capable of many things. Subtlety is not among them. Love sighed. Inspector Harcourt won't be happy. He wants this tied up quickly. Harcourt, Purbright murmured, prefers a tidy explanation. Unfortunately, tidy explanations often conceal the untidiest truths. He began walking back toward the station, hands in pockets, eyes thoughtful. Love followed, looking puzzled but trusting. Sir, he said after a moment, if Waffle isn't our culprit, then who is? That, Purbright replied, is what we must determine. But suspects chosen for convenience rarely fit the crime. And in this case, he paused, gazing toward the fairground tent still visible in the distance. A convenience is the least convincing motive of all. Inspector Harcourt was waiting inside the station, arms folded in the manner of a man who believed folding one's arms lent authority to a weak argument. His moustache bristled when Purbright informed him of Waffle's unlikely involvement. You're dismissing him too quickly, Harcourt said, pacing. The man has a history, and a history of mischief, Purbright corrected gently. Not craftsmanship, nor intrusions into emotional symbolism. Harcourt frowned. Symbolism? Purbright nodded. The bridal theme, the meticulous design, the secrecy. Such features suggest a motive rooted not in prankishness, but in something decidedly more personal. Or, Harcourt countered, they suggest an unstable hobbyist who fancies himself a puppeteer. You fix this the cook? Purbright offered a diplomatic nod. That remains a possibility, but Waffle is a man motivated by whimsy, not obsession. Harcourt exhaled sharply. Then who Purbright would meddle with a life-size bride? That, Purbright said, is precisely the question we must allow the evidence, not convenience, to answer. Harcourt threw up his hands. Fine. Proceed as you see fit. But the longer this lingers, the faster gossip grows. And gossip, as you know, can be disastrous. Only, Purbright said mildly, when it is more inventive than the truth. He left Harcourt muttering into his moustache and returned to his desk. The faint lavender scent from the day before drifted back through his thoughts like a quiet reminder. If Waffle was not the hand behind the strangeness, then someone else had stood close to Mellin's bride that morning, close enough to adjust lace, touch glass, or perhaps whisper something only dolls and guilty hearts could hear. Convenience had offered its suspect. Purbright, however, felt sure the real culprit would be far less obliging. The morning after Harcourt's insistence upon tidy suspects, Purbright found himself once again near the fairground tent where Mellin's glass-encased bride still stood. The crowds had thinned. Only a pair of council clerks remained, engaged in the delicate operation of pretending not to be frightened by a life-sized doll. They cast brief glances toward the figure as though expecting it to speak, or blink, or perhaps request a seat at the next parish meeting. Purbright approached with the same quiet unhurriedness that tended to calm both people and porcelain. A faint chill drifted off the grass, dew clung to the canvas, giving the entire tent the appearance of something recently awakened from sleep. The bride stood exactly as before, veil draped in its immaculate fall, bouquet fixed in both hands, head tilted the slightest degree toward the right. Yet something about the lace seemed newly conspicuous to him this morning, as though the overnight quiet had peeled back a layer of familiarity and revealed the detail beneath. Purbright leaned forward, careful not to brush the glass. The lace was beautiful, old certainly, with a delicacy almost too fine for modern manufacture. He recognized the pattern, not because he possessed detailed knowledge of bridal finery, but because he had seen it once in an entirely different context, the lilac and loom haberdashery. More precisely, the remains of the shop after the late Mrs. Glendora Wickett had closed it before her passing 2 years ago. Purbright had been there only once, investigating an unrelated matter involving misdelivered parcels, but he remembered her lace. Mrs. Wickett had prided herself loudly and often on her imported Valencians, her antique trims, and her endless catalogues of discontinued patterns. Yet the pattern on the doll's veil, Purbright traced it with his gaze, was unmistakably from the final set she had kept locked in a drawer for special customers only, which in Flaxborough meant anyone who could appreciate the significance of the distinction. But the Mellins, as far as he knew, had never patronized that shop. Winifred possessed no fondness for frippery. Horace's interests lay in wood, wax, and solitude. And Mrs. Wickett's belongings had been auctioned off quietly after her death. Her stock had been snapped up by collectors from Lincoln before townsfolk even had time to pretend they were interested. So how had Mellin, or someone near him, acquired lace no longer available anywhere in Flaxborough? Purbright stepped back, hands in pockets, thoughts arranging themselves with the patient precision of someone setting out chess pieces for an opponent who might not yet realize they were playing. He left the tent and turned toward the narrow street where lilac and loom had once stood. The shop now housed a small nail salon whose signage blared a pink enthusiasm Flaxborough had never requested. But the building's original window remained tall and dignified, and Purbright paused there before climbing the short steps to the attached flat. He knocked. After a moment, the door opened to reveal Mrs. Grattan, niece of the late Mrs. Wickett and current reluctant owner of the properties. She wore a dressing gown, and a look that suggested mourning was an unnecessary invention. "Inspector," she said flatly, "I can't imagine why you'd want me." "Only a question or two," Purbright answered pleasantly. Concerning some old lace, her expression did not change. "All sold. Every scrap. Vultures from the city took it. I tried to keep a bundle of my aunt's for myself, but someone made off with the box during the auction." Purbright raised an eyebrow. "Made off?" "Fool!" Mrs. Grattan gave an irritated shrug. "One moment it was there under the table, the next it was gone. Typical. Everyone wanted a piece of Aunt Glenda, more than they ever wanted her while she was alive." Purbright inclined his head sympathetically. "Do you recall who attended the auction?" "Half the town. The Mellin pair were there, now that I think of it." Winifred stood in the back looking like she'd rather have been scrubbing something. Horace wandered about staring at everyone's shoes. Purbright paused. "Did either purchase anything?" "I know, but they lingered by the textile table longer than was proper. I remember because Winifred kept smoothing the cloth rolls, then jerking her hand away, almost as if she didn't trust herself with them." A small, quiet thread tugged at Purbright's mind. "Thank you, Mrs. Grattan." "You've been most helpful. That makes one of us," she said, shutting the door. Purbright walked next to the florist's shop, where the window displayed a modest arrangement of autumn colours. The scent of dried petals drifted faintly. He stepped inside, greeted by the tapping of scissors and a murmur of low conversation from behind the counter. Lydia Henslow looked up with a start. She was a young woman with gentle features and a bruise on her wrist that someone might easily overlook, unless, as Purbright did, one made a habit of noticing the things people preferred to keep unnoticed. "Inspector," she said nervously, "do you need flowers? Do you need flowers?" "Only answers," Purbright said lightly. Buck said, "I wondered whether you might recognize a particular lace. Something rare, something old." He described the pattern as she set down her scissors, brow furrowing in concentration. "Oh," she said softly, "Mrs. Wickett had that sort. I saw it once when I was helping her pack things after she'd fallen ill. She told me never to touch it, said it was too fine for ordinary fingers." "Did you ever see anyone else handle it?" Purbright asked. Well, Winifred Mellin was there a few times," Lydia said. "Helping Mrs. Wickett sort belongings. She seemed very interested in the textiles. I thought it odd at the time." "Of the time? Odd, Winifred never liked pretty things," Lydia said simply. That, Purbright mused, was true, and precisely why it now mattered. His gaze fell to the bruise on her wrist. "Are you all right, Miss Henslow?" "Oh, this. I dropped a vase. Her voice wavered the tiniest bit. Purbright did not press. People seldom told the truth when they were not ready to. They preferred small fictions that fit more neatly into their daily routines. He thanked her and stepped back out into the cool afternoon. The sky had taken on a metallic grey, the sort that pressed low upon the rooftops and encouraged thoughts to drift more slowly. Purbright walked toward the station, not quickly, but with the purposeful stillness of someone letting connections settle into place without forcing them. The lace was older than the doll, older than the commission Mellon denied receiving, older than the current trouble, perhaps. Yet it sat upon the bride's veil as though chosen deliberately, as though someone wanted that particular detail, that relic of a dead woman's stock, preserved in front of all of Flaxborough. A detail one would not expect in a mere experiment, a detail too personal to be accidental. Purbright paused mid-step. The faint scent of lavender brushed past again, subtle but distinct, a reminder, a thread, the same fragrance that clung to the doll, to Mellon's stall, to something half-remembered, a fragrance Mrs. Wickett had used to line her drawers of antique lace. And perhaps someone else still used. Something quiet and long-buried had begun to surface in Flaxborough, delicate as lace and twice as entangled. Purbright walked on, the town's stillness whispering around him, each step a small stitch drawing the pattern toward revelation. The walk back to the station took Purbright past the river, where the late afternoon light lay flat across the water and encouraged thoughts of a quieter species than Flaxborough usually tolerated. He paused on the footbridge, leaning lightly on the railing. The town moved behind him in its habitual rhythm, shop doors opening and shutting, bicycles rattling over cobblestones, voices rising in the practiced cadence of everyday fussing. And yet beneath this dependable surface, something strained, like a taut thread just shy of snapping. The lace, the bruise on Lydia's wrist, Simper's uncertain recollection, Winifred's defensive rigidity, none of these pieces made a crime in themselves. But they began to resemble the outline of one. Not the kind marked by violence or stolen goods, but the kind shaped by secret grief, long-nursed grievances, and the private ache of those who had grown adept at silence. Purbright had learned long ago that crimes in small towns were rarely grand. They did not centre on conspiracies or cunning villains. Instead, they sprung from the soft, persistent pressures of ordinary life. Disappointment, jealousy, loneliness, thwarted affection. A lifetime of restrained emotion could find its expression in the simplest of objects. A letter misplaced, a gift returned, a doll made with too much care. Mellon's bride was such an object. Purbright replayed the moment of Mellon's collapse at the fair, the whispered plea, the trembling hands, the way his gaze had fixed not on the crowd, nor on his sister, but on the doll, as if the figure itself were a reminder of something unbearable. As if he had made not merely a creation, but a confession, the shift of the eyes remained the strangest part. Purbright did not believe in supernatural phenomena, yet he believed fervently in human capability, especially the capability of people to deceive themselves. Perception was a delicate instrument, influenced as much by hope or fear as by truth. But too many witnesses, too many descriptions. Grey eyes in the morning, blue by midday. Even Mellon's own confusion suggested that the change was real, or at least engineered. But engineered by whom? Purbright resumed walking. The police station greeted him with its usual air of earnest drabness. Sergeant Love glanced up from a desk strewn with reports and sweet wrappers, his face brightening at the inspector's return. "A long walk, sir?" "Lay thoughtful one," Purbright replied, removing his coat. "Any developments in our absence?" "Inspector Harcourt wants to call a meeting," Love said with mild dread. "He says public reassurance is vital. Wants us to confirm we're pursuing a promising line of inquiry." Purbright allowed himself a sigh soft enough not to wound. "Promising to whom, I wonder?" "To him, sir," Love said. "He's convinced Waffle's the answer." "Convenience," Purbright murmured. "It seems to be Inspector Harcourt's favourite tool." Love hesitated. "You don't think Waffle did it?" "What," Purbright said gently, "is a gust of wind in a town accustomed to draughts. The fair's bride, however, is a product of deliberation." Love nodded, though it was clear his curiosity had begun to push gently at the boundaries of his restraint. "Sir, what do you think happened?" Purbright smiled faintly. "I think someone has been nursing a memory too long. And memories, Sergeant, are rarely as obedient as we wish." Love frowned. "You believe this is personal? In Flaxborough?" Purbright said. "Everything is personal. Towns like ours thrive on the cultivation of tiny histories. Resentments pass through families like heirlooms, longing pressed into drawers like lavender between linen. These small things accumulate. They shape lives." Love blinked. "A lavender, sir." Purbright paused, considering how much to reveal. Oh, he decided on only the faintest breadcrumb. "A fragrance," he said softly. "One that lingers in more places than seems reasonable." Love looked puzzled, which was exactly how Purbright preferred him for the moment. After the sergeant returned to his paperwork, Purbright settled into his chair and allowed the room to fade around him. He pictured Horace Mellin in his workshop, thin, anxious hands coated with wax dust. A man who rarely spoke above a murmur, who had no close friends, who lived with a sister whose presence was less companionable than supervisory. A man who might have built a bride not for artistic purpose, nor even craft fair admiration, but out of longing. A replica, perhaps. A remembrance. But the lace did not belong to longing. The lace belonged to something else. Something precise, deliberate, and fiercely protected. Winifred's reaction earlier returned to him. The stiff shoulders, the half-second pause before insisting she had not assisted him, the tremor of possessiveness in her voice. There was a jealousy in her, quiet but taut. A woman whose life revolved around duty and order often cultivated an inner garden of emotions that grew wild when unattended. Had she resented something Horace had once had? Something or someone she could not control? Purbright did not need melodrama to conceive of this. He had seen such patterns before. A brother whose gentle nature made him manageable. A sister who depended on that dependability. And somewhere, years ago, perhaps a disruption. Someone entering Horace's life whom Winifred found unwelcome. Someone who left, but left a mark. The scent of lavender, the special lace, the secrecy around the bride, the moulds destroyed in the workshop fire days ago, all suggested a singular truth forming slowly, like clay taking shape under steady hands. Someone in the Mellin household had been trying to recreate the past, and someone else, he suspected, had been trying just as hard to erase it. Purbright leaned back, letting the pattern form without giving it definition too soon. He did not believe in rushing conclusions. Human hearts, he knew, did not reveal their motives tidily. They required patience, understanding, and the occasional nudge. Outside, the evening deepened. The windows dimmed with the onset of dusk, and the town settled into its customary hush. Lamps flickered on in the homes along the lane, each one holding its own small world of secrets, some harmless, some less so. Purbright looked once more at the thin folder on his desk, at the notes he'd made about Mellin, his sister, the stolen lace, the shifting eyes. It was no longer a matter of whether a crime had occurred, but of determining what kind of crime it was. Some acts wounded bodies, some wounded reputations. The most dangerous, however, wounded the soul, and those Purbright knew were never committed quickly. He folded his hands, the faint lavender memory lingering in his thoughts. Somewhere in Flaxborough, a heart sore from old love or old fear had driven a pair of hands to shape a bride in glass. And hearts wounded long ago, he reflected, had a way of bleeding into the present, even when wrapped in laced exit. By the time Purbright stepped into the mellow lamplight of the Flaxborough Council room that Friday evening, he had prepared the sort of gathering that appeared, at first glance, too harmless to hold any intention. The long table was laid out with modest biscuits, weak tea, and neatly sharpened pencils, objects chosen specifically for their capacity to disarm. A room furnished with such innocent items could hardly be accused of plotting anything. Yet Purbright had invited people whose nerves twitched at the slightest suggestion of scrutiny. Mr. Simper, who entered with the posture of a man expecting reproach before greeting. Lydia Henslow, twisting her gloves as though their fabric required wringing. And Winifred Mellin, who walked in stiffly, chin high, as if determined not to surrender an inch of dignity under any circumstances. Even Mrs. Venner appeared, drawn by the irresistible scent of potential scandal. Purbright greeted each in turn with a warm politeness that bordered on indulgence. His tone implied an evening of administrative clarification, an event designed for tedium, not tension. And yet, beneath that polite veneer, every movement, every word, every offered biscuit was placed with meticulous intention. "We will not be long," he assured the room, holding his teacup lightly. "Just a brief review of yesterday's statements. A matter of ensuring no confusion lingers. Simper immediately looked confused, which was predictable and even helpful. Purbright motioned for everyone to sit. Added not at the beginning, but near the end. Winifred's breathing had quickened, though she tried to mask it with composure. Purbright continued as though making idle conversation. And lace carries memory. The scent, the feel, it binds the past to the present, The person who placed it there wanted something remembered. Lydia made a small sound, like a breath held too long. Winifred's chair scraped faintly as she sat down again, more from necessity than choice. Purbright arranged the papers before him with the air of a man concluding a routine discussion. But his voice, when he spoke again, held a subtle firmness underlying its calm. One last matter. People rarely attempt to destroy what they cherish. Fires, for instance, do not start themselves in workshops filled with molds recently used. They begin because someone cannot bear the presence of what those molds represent. He looked at no one, and he looked at everyone. The brittle quiet that followed was not the quiet of peace. It was the quiet of realization settling, slowly, uneasily, into several minds at once. Purbright closed his notebook gently. "Thank you all. You've been very helpful. I believe the picture is beginning to clear." Winifred stood again, too quickly this time, as though needing to move before her thoughts trapped her. "If you have more questions, Inspector," she said stiffly, "you know where to find me." "Yes," Purbright said softly. "I do." She hesitated, then left the room with a pace caught between dignity and flight. Simper let out the breath he'd held for minutes. Lydia followed more quietly, her eyes troubled. Mrs. Venner bustled out eagerly, already assembling her version of the evening. When the room finally emptied, Purbright remained seated, his expression contemplative. He had asked nothing directly accusing. He had made no demand, no confrontation. Just a series of gentle observations placed with care, and one of them, he was certain, had struck precisely where needed. A polite trap, he reflected, need not snap shut to be effective. It need only shift the balance of fear within the guilty mind. And now Winifred Mellin, who had guarded her brother, their past, and something deeper still, was no longer standing quite so steadily on the ground she believed hers. The next move, he knew, would not be his. It would be hers. The morning after the council room gathering dawned with the flat, pewter light of a day that did not intend to make anything easy. Purbright walked toward the Mellin home with the slow, steady tread of a man allowing each step to settle the thoughts formed overnight. He had not slept poorly, only lightly, his mind churning through the quiet details, the offhand slips, the tremors in voices. Something somewhere had already begun to give way. Winifred Mellin opened the door before he knocked. Her expression was composed, but in the way of porcelain, flawless at a distance, brittle when touched. Behind her the house was silent, too silent. "Inspector," she said, "if you have returned to interrogate my brother, you'll find him unwell." "I am not here for interrogation," Purbright replied gently. "I hoped we might talk somewhere. Neutral." Her eyes narrowed faintly. "A neutral? A quiet place," he said, "where we may speak plainly without worrying your brother." "The town library's side reading room, perhaps." Winifred hesitated, a flicker of calculation in her gaze. She did not want to go, but refusing would mark her as uncooperative, and Winifred Mellin valued propriety almost as fiercely as she valued control. "Very well," she said. "It." They walked without speaking, the town's gentle bustle flowing around them. When they reached the library, Teresa Bolland looked up from the front desk with startled curiosity. Purbright offered her a nod of reassurance, and she quickly led them to the small reading room, where afternoon light filtered in through soft curtains. Winifred sat stiffly. Purbright chose the chair opposite, close enough to read her expression, far enough to prevent her feeling cornered. He began in a voice mild as dust. "Mrs. Venner informed me she once overheard soft crying from your workshop." Winifred's lips tightened. Venner hears her own loneliness everywhere she walks." "Quite possible," Purbright said, unmoved. "Yet she is seldom wrong about emotional sounds. People often notice what they feel themselves." Winifred said nothing. Purbright folded his hands. "Your brother is recovering. Dr. Billsworth believes his collapse was less physical exhaustion than emotional distress. A distress tied, perhaps, to something revived. Something he'd tried to leave behind." "I don't know what you mean," Winifred replied, too quickly. Purbright continued, gentle as a feather on water. "I've been thinking about the lace. Old, rare, hidden by Mrs. Wickett, stolen during the auction. appearing years later on a bridal doll crafted in great secrecy. Her pulse fluttered visibly at her throat. And the lavender, he said softly, a fragrance that lingers. A scent your brother recognized even if he did not say so. Winifred's fingers curled inward. Inspector, I don't know, he interrupted very gently. Miss Mellon, who was she? Winifred's breath caught so quickly, so sharply, that denial became impossible. Tears did not fall, but the eyes that had remained dry through years of quiet discipline glistened. Purbright's voice softened further. The doll was modelled after someone, not a stranger, not a barmaid, someone your brother lost. Winifred's voice when it emerged was barely audible. Her name was Clara. The room held its breath. Purbright waited. Patience was his most reliable instrument. She came to our father's shop as a customer, Winifred said, staring at her hands. Quiet girl, beautiful in a frail, uncertain way. Horace adored her. I thought she adored him. They spoke of marrying. Her voice trembled. He carved little wooden toys for her. She embroidered little cloth pieces for him, simple things, sweet things. And then, Purbright prompted, a boating accident, she whispered. At least, that is what people believed. The river flooded quickly that spring. She went out walking and never returned. They found her shawl near the water. People said she slipped. People said her throat closed. People said many things. But your brother, Purbright murmured, and never stopped loving her. Winifred looked up sharply, but there was no anger, only the exhausted truth. No, he never stopped. He tried to be strong, tried to forget, but he couldn't. And he wouldn't talk about her. Not to me, not to anyone. That scent you mentioned, lavender, she wore it. Always. Purbright watched her carefully. So you preserved it. A shudder passed through her. I kept one of her old sachets. Horace didn't know. I thought I was protecting him. The words cracked in the middle, like china under strain. But the lace, Purbright said. That was hers, Winifred whispered, from a little bridal handkerchief she embroidered once. I saved it after the auction. I couldn't bear to think of strangers handling it. Purbright nodded slowly. You added it to the doll. Winifred closed her eyes. I had to. Horace's doll, it was Clara. It was Clara. It was her face, her figure, the way she tilted her head. He said it was a commission, but it wasn't. It was memory. And when I saw what he was making, saw her return in wax and cloth, I thought her voice broke. I thought it might bring him peace. Purbright waited. But then she continued, voice thin as thread. He started talking to it, touching its hands, whispering to it, like before, like she had come back. And a sudden anguish surged through her composure. I couldn't lose him again. So you tried to destroy the molds, Purbright said gently. She flinched. I didn't mean to start a fire. I just wanted the molds gone. If the doll couldn't be copied, then maybe he would forget. You don't understand, Inspector. Horace isn't strong. I had to hold our lives together after Clara died. I had to keep him steady. He was slipping away again. Purbright spoke softly. And the eyes? Winifred hesitated. Then they were grey, like hers, but Horace, he couldn't bear that. So he made them blue, said she might have grown older with blue eyes. It wasn't madness, Inspector, just grief reshaping itself. And his collapse? Winifred's eyes filled finally with tears. He saw the lace, he recognized it. He thought it meant Clara was near. He thought I was hiding her from him. It was too much. A long silence followed, gentle, respectful. Purbright breathed out slowly. No crime of violence has been committed here, only a crime of the heart. And those, he said softly, are the most painful of all. Winifred bowed her head, defeated by her own devotion. What will happen now? Purbright rose, his voice steady. Your brother will recover. You will tell him the truth, not all at once, but kindly, when he is ready. The doll will remain in council storage. Lydia will help see to it. Winifred blinked. Lydia? She understands grief, Purbright said simply, and she understands gentleness. Tears slipped down Winifred's cheeks. I only wanted to protect him. You did, Purbright said. But protection, like love, sometimes becomes too tight a grip. He offered his hand, not for restraint, but for steadiness. Winifred took it. Outside the day lightened slightly, enough to cast a pale warmth into the reading room. The bridal doll, safely locked away, would trouble no one now, but the truths beneath its creation had finally stepped into the open gob. And Purbright, with the quiet weight of understanding, knew the last chapter would not be written in tragedy, but in something quieter, acceptance. The days following Purbright's conversation with Winifred Mellon settled over Flaxborough with the muted calm that often succeeds a storm no one fully admits occurred. Nothing dramatic changed. The town seldom tolerated drama for long. Instead, small adjustments took place quietly, almost invisibly, as though residents collectively agreed to smooth out the disrupted air without acknowledging it had ever stirred. Horace Mellon recovered slowly. Dr. Billsworth reported that his strength returned in gentle increments, like a clock being wound by careful hands. He spoke little at first, though when he did, his voice held a kind of clarity absent before. The shadows that had weighed him seemed lighter, not gone, but rearranged, no longer tipping him forward as if towards some invisible brink. Winifred was often at his side, but not in the rigid, watchful posture she had once maintained. Something in her had softened. Purbright observed her once from across the road. She helped her brother into the garden, adjusting his scarf with unhurried tenderness rather than anxious precision. A small human gesture, but in a household where silence had long been mistaken for stability, it felt like a shift in the very architecture. Rumour, naturally, moved more quickly than recovery. Flaxborough's chatterers debated endlessly why the bridal doll had vanished from the fair tent. Officially, it was placed into council storage pending administrative review, a phrase that satisfied no one yet discouraged further inquiry. Mrs. Pendred insisted the doll had been spirited away for fear it might unsettle the younger ladies. Mrs. Venner became convinced it had been confiscated after exhibiting signs of spiritual disturbance. Mr. Simper tried to explain that its removal was purely procedural, but quickly realized that Flaxborough preferred its mysteries garnished, not clarified. Lydia Henslow was the only one who visited the storage room with any regularity. Purbright saw her there one afternoon, unlocking the side door with a careful hand. She looked relieved to find him passing by. "I'm just checking the cabinet," she said. "Sometimes lace collects dust quickly." Purbright nodded, understanding that she wasn't truly speaking about lace. "How are the Mellons?" Lydia hesitated, then smiled. "Better. I think Winifred has realized she doesn't need to guard everything alone." "That realization," Purbright said gently, "is a gift not everyone grants themselves." Lydia's smile softened. "Horace asked for the window open today. He wanted the breeze. I don't think he's done that in years." Such small details, Purbright thought, were often the most telling. Inside the storage room, the bridal doll stood in its glass case with the serenity it had lacked at the fair. The lace still draped over its veil, its blue eyes, static, unmoving, reflecting only dust motes drifting in the afternoon light. There was no mystery now, no shifting colours, no illusions. Gollers. The figure was simply what it had been all along, a creation shaped by grief, devotion, and a longing too stubborn to fade quietly. Purbright regarded it for a moment. "Objects," he said softly, "often carry more of us than we intend." Lydia folded her hands. "Will the council return it to the Mellons?" "Not for now," Purbright replied. "Some things are better left resting." She nodded as if she understood more than he expected. When he stepped back into the street, the late afternoon sun had broken through the clouds, casting a fragile warmth over the market square. People moved about in their customary fashion, buying bread, walking dogs, exchanging brief nods that conveyed entire conversations in Flaxborough's compact emotional vocabulary. Harcourt intercepted him near the corner, wearing an expression that suggested displeasure, tempered by the knowledge that he could not voice it. "No charges?" he asked. "None," Purbright said calmly. Harcourt exhaled through his moustache. "And you're satisfied?" Purbright considered this. "Satisfaction is the wrong word, but the truth is sufficient." Harcourt muttered something about a psychological entanglements and wandered off before responsibility for understanding any of it could be assigned to him. Purbright resumed his walk, taking the long route back to the station. He passed the river bank where Clara's name, never spoken publicly, seemed to linger in the air as softly as the scent of lavender had lingered around the doll. He paused there a moment, imagining Horace and Clara as they had once been, two quiet souls finding comfort in each other's company, unaware of how delicate such comfort could be. Love found him there 5 minutes later, holding a stack of papers. "Sir? I thought you might want these signed." Purbright smiled. "The world insists on paperwork, Sergeant." Love grinned. "A better paperwork than fire, sir, or dolls." Quite. They walked together toward the station, Love chatting about minor incidents, Purbright listening with half an ear. His thoughts drifted to the melons, to Clara, to the doll in its cabinet, its purpose finally fulfilled. The town would forget the incident soon enough, reshaping it into a tale of eccentric craftsmanship or minor scandal. But for those directly touched by it, something quieter had changed, an inner recalibration that no gossip could fully grasp. As they approached the station steps, Purbright paused, taking in the street one last time. Flaxborough looked as it always had, orderly, modest, faintly absurd in its rituals and preoccupations. Yet beneath its surface lived the same complex tapestry found in any human place, longing, fear, tenderness, missteps, and the stubborn hope that life might still offer gentleness. Love held the door open. Coming in, sir?" "In a moment," Purbright said. He stood alone for a final breath, letting the stillness settle. Then, with the quiet resolve of a man returning to ordinary duties after guiding a fragile truth into daylight, Inspector Purbright stepped inside.